Ma'am, this section's reserved for equity partners. You'll need to step outside the perimeter. That's what the security guard said. Loud enough for the crowd of developers, investors, and executives to hear. Loud enough to turn heads. Loud enough to make it clear someone didn't belong. It was 9:14 a.m. on a crisp fall morning at the Baycrest Marina redevelopment site in Charleston, South Carolina. The air smelled like dust and money. Hard hats. Suits. Cement mixers rumbling in the background. News crews gathered near the velvet ropes. And standing just outside the fence line, calm, poised, unbothered, was Dania Price, 43 years old, in a long black trench coat, no assistant, no clipboard. To the guard, she looked like media. Or maybe someone hoping for a networking moment. What she actually was: the single largest equity partner in the entire $87 million redevelopment. She just didn't look the part. Dania stepped forward, flashing a digital badge on her phone. The guard squinted. I've been instructed to let through only named partners, executives and property heads. Dania didn't raise her voice. She never had to. I am the named partner. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the crowd. This one smoother. Rehearsed. I'm sorry, miss, are you lost? The man approaching was tall. White. Late 40s. Check blazer. Confident grin that always came with inheritance. His name was Craig Ellison, managing director of Ellison Row Properties, one of the legacy developers on the Baycrest project. He looked at Dania like she was an intruder. She looked at him like a lesson he was about to learn. Before we dive deeper, let me ask you something. Have you ever built something, funded it, shaped it, carried the risk, only to walk into the room and be treated like a stranger in your own story? Have you ever been asked to prove your worth, not because of your numbers, but because of how you looked walking through the gate? If you have, then this story is for you. And if it's already got your attention, like, share, subscribe, and drop your city or country in the comments. Because someone you know has lived this, and they need to hear what comes next. Back on site, Craig's condescension turned to discomfort when Dania calmly replied. I'm Dania Price, majority investor, primary underwriter, and the woman who owns the zoning rights under your Phase 2 tower. Craig's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. The security guard stepped back. Dania wasn't here for debate. She walked past the line, through the velvet rope, across the gravel lot, into the circle of suits that had suddenly gone silent. The press hadn't expected her. That was intentional. She wasn't listed on the press release. No camera-ready sound bites. No handshakes for photo ops. She came here for one reason: to see with her own eyes if the whispers were true. And when she saw it, her eyes narrowed. Behind the scaffolding, a temporary banner flapped in the wind. Baycrest Marina, a legacy of low-country heritage, led by Ellison Row. No mention of Price Equity Group. No mention of Dania. No mention of the woman whose capital saved the project from collapse last year. She turned to Craig, now approaching carefully. Did you authorize that banner? He shrugged, trying to recover his smirk. Marketing makes these calls. Nothing personal. You're right, Dania said. It's not personal. It's contractual. She pulled a thin folder from her bag. Inside, an agreement, signed 9 months ago. Clause 14.3 stated clearly, all public-facing materials must equally represent all named partners. She handed it to a stunned assistant. You have until 2 p.m. to remove the banner and issue a corrected media statement. If you don't, I'll invoke the breach clause and pull my funding. You can explain to the board why the whole marina goes dark tomorrow. The mood shifted. reporters began whispering. One pulled out his phone and started typing fast. And Dania? She turned, walked back to her black SUV, and disappeared down the waterfront drive like a storm that didn't need to shout to be felt. Back in the Ellison Road trailer office, panic had already begun. "Pull the banner," Craig snapped, "and find a PR writer who can spin this in 5 minutes. But it was too late. Because the moment Dania stepped back into her own downtown headquarters, she picked up the phone. "Start preparing the buyout papers. I'm tired of having my name erased from buildings I paid to lift." The boardroom was quiet when she entered. No fanfare. No raised voices. No open laptops. Just the air of dread that only descends when the people who underestimated you suddenly realize you're not bluffing. It was 10:47 a.m. on the 33rd floor of the Ellison Road Development Tower, Charleston's glass and brick temple to generational power. Dania Price walked in wearing a slate gray blazer, no jewelry, no makeup, and the steady posture of someone who'd spent years learning how to make silence louder than shouting. Seated around the table were 7 men, 5 developers, 1 investment attorney, and Craig Ellison himself, trying to look calm behind a fresh espresso and his barely touched notepad. Dania didn't sit. She dropped a slim folder on the table. The sound of it landing cut through the silence, like a stone hitting a still pond. "I'm here to present my revised offer," she said, "and my final terms." Craig cleared his throat, trying to reclaim the room. "Dania, look, we can admit the banner was deliberate," she cut in. Craig's smile faltered. "You've had 3 branding meetings in the last quarter," Dania said, already flipping through her own notes. "I wasn't invited to any of them. Not by accident. By design. Okay, now hold on." She slid a printed email across the table. It was from the firm's comms director to Craig. "Remove Price branding from Phase 2 rollout. Focus on Ellison Road legacy angle." No one spoke. Dania continued. "You erased me from my own deal, so I'm giving you a new one." She opened the folder again and handed out 1 page to each man. It was clean, formal, sharp as a blade. Buyout terms: immediate transfer of full development ownership to Price Equity Group. Offer price: $46.7 million. Deadline to accept: 72 hours. Craig laughed, but no one joined him. "You're trying to buy us out of our own flagship." Dania stared straight at him. "You already tried to erase me. Now I'm doing the paperwork." The room froze. No one had expected this. Because it wasn't revenge. It was business. Calculated. Controlled. Ruthless in its elegance. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had someone try to shrink your legacy down to a logo? Erase your present while cashing your checks? Take your brilliance and paste someone else's name over it? If you've ever lived that, then you understand exactly what Dania did next. She turned to the investment attorney. "Your firm negotiated the original equity share, correct?" He nodded cautiously. "Then you're aware of Clause 6.2, the failure to disclose penalty tied to media representation." He blinked. Dania handed him another sheet. "I've calculated the penalty. If this board refuses the buyout and I file breach, you'll owe my firm $5.2 million in damages. Plus, your investor deck for Phase 3 becomes public record during arbitration." Craig's voice cracked. "You wouldn't." Dania raised one eyebrow. "I already did." News of the offer broke within 2 hours. Local media ran with the headline: "Dania Price offers buyout after partner erasure scandal." Industry blogs added fuel. "Black woman developer flips power dynamic in Charleston luxury project." And deep in the finance world, where everyone pretends equity is neutral, private emails buzzed with one repeated phrase. She just turned the game inside out. Back in her office, Dania stood at the glass wall overlooking the marina. It wasn't just business anymore. It was blood memory. Because 25 years ago, her mother had worked as a hotel cook 2 blocks from that same marina. They'd walk home after night shifts, past the boarded-up warehouses where Baycrest now stood. Her mother used to say, "Maybe one day you'll work here, in a real office, with your name on the door." Dania never corrected her. She knew even then, she wasn't going to work there. She was going to own it. The next morning, Craig sent a text. "Can we talk privately before the board votes?" Dania replied with a single line. "You had your turn." Craig Ellison didn't sleep the night after Dania delivered her buyout terms. He paced the wood floors of his downtown penthouse, laptop open, eyes bloodshot. The board had 48 hours left to vote, and the tide wasn't looking good. 3 members were leaning in Dania's favor. 2 were undecided. Only he and Arthur Bell, his longtime fixer, were hard against it. He needed leverage. And in Craig's world, when charm failed, the smear campaign started. At 7:36 a.m., Arthur showed up in his office with a manila envelope. "Pulled this from a background search," Arthur said. "You're gonna want to read the second page." Inside was a scanned article from 2009. Headline: "Upstart developer caught in legal dispute over permits. Claims racial bias." The photo was small, black and white, grainy. But the woman was unmistakably Dania. Younger. Hair natural and loose. Eyes defiant. The article went on to describe how Dania, at just 27, had been denied a zoning approval for her first community development project in South Carolina. After filing a civil complaint against the city for discriminatory practices, she lost the case, and almost lost her business. It had been buried for years. Now, Craig planned to dig it up. That afternoon, the board convened for a private hearing to discuss Dania's proposal. But just before it began, a new agenda item appeared on the docket: review of partner suitability and prior conduct. Dania, already seated at the table, immediately understood what was coming. Craig stood, calm, confident, holding the envelope. "Before we vote," he said, "the board deserves full transparency. We owe it to the legacy of this project." He slid the article onto the table. "This was never disclosed in our initial partnership paperwork. Let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone try to use your past, your survival, as a weapon against your present? Have you ever seen your integrity turned into a liability because someone else was afraid of your strength? If so, then you already know how Dania responded. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask for time to speak with legal. She simply pushed the article back across the table and said, "Yes, that was me. I was 27, young, broke, and determined not to let a group of men tell me I wasn't allowed to build something decent for families who'd been ignored for decades. The city said I didn't have the credentials. But the truth? They didn't want a black woman owning land on the waterfront. I lost that case. But I won the next one. And the next. And this project you're trying to gatekeep? It wouldn't exist without the money that came from those wins." She let the words breathe, then added, "You want to talk about legacy? Mine is built on resistance. Yours is built on entitlement." The room fell into a deep, unsettled silence. It wasn't anger. It was realization. Because while Craig tried to paint her as unstable, what the board saw was resolve. They saw someone who had taken the hits and kept building. The twist? That article Craig tried to weaponize. It had a footnote, a quote from a civil rights attorney at the time. "One day, they'll put her name on something big." and the people who stood in her way won't even be in the credits. The board read it twice. Then quietly, one of the undecided directors, a South Asian developer named Nikhil Patel, spoke up. I was denied my first housing permit because my English wasn't clear enough for the city council. He turned to Craig. If she's unfit because she fought injustice, then so am I. He slid his vote to Dania. By the end of the meeting, it was 4-3. Craig's last hope was to stall. But the clock was ticking. And outside, something else had started. Local reporters had gotten wind of the vote. Someone leaked the article. But it backfired. Because the public didn't see scandal. They saw survival. They saw someone who took her worst moment and turned it into a platform. And they started showing up. Outside the development building. On social media. In business forums. #PricePower began trending. Back in her office, Dania watched it unfold with tired eyes and a quiet smile. She hadn't planned for this. But she was ready for it. Because you don't fight for years just to be handed a win. You fight so that when the door opens, you're the one holding the keys. It was just after sunrise when Dania's car pulled up to the Ellison Road Tower for the last time. The city was still waking, but her mind had been racing for hours. She'd barely slept. Not out of nerves, but clarity. That strange kind of mental stillness that only arrives when you realize the fight is already over. The other side just hasn't accepted it yet. The boardroom was scheduled for one final meeting. One final vote. But Dania? She had no intention of watching Craig Ellison get dragged out. Not publicly. Not for show. She was giving him something rare in business. A quiet exit. A lifeboat. Whether or not he had the sense to take it, that would be his decision. She entered the conference room 10 minutes early. Craig was already seated. Alone. Pale. Unshaven. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in 3 days and had just realized no one was coming to save him. Dania placed a small envelope on the table. He eyed it cautious. What's this? A legal notice? She shook her head. An offer. Craig hesitated. Why? Because even after everything, I'm not interested in watching another man fall apart in public. I came to build, not humiliate. He opened it. Inside, a 1-page agreement. A full buyout of his personal stake. Clean. No lawsuit. No press statement. He'd walk away with $9.3 million. He could rebuild somewhere else. Quietly, Dania folded her hands. This is more than generous. You've got 30 minutes before the board convenes. Craig didn't answer right away. Instead, he just sat there, tapping the paper with the edge of his pen, his ego wrestling with his reality. Then finally, with a forced laugh, he said, You know you're dangerous. Dania smiled faintly. No, I'm prepared. He looked up. You could have played the long game, eased in. But no, you stormed the gates. Made a scene. Brought the world down on me. And for what? A project that was dying before you even signed the check? Dania's voice was calm. This was never about just the marina. It's about what it represents. And how people like you treat people like me until we have enough equity to own the room. Craig pushed the offer back across the table. No deal. I'm not walking away from what my family built. I'll take my chances in arbitration. Dania didn't flinch. She stood, collected her folder, and paused at the door. Last chance, Craig. He didn't look up. See you in court. But court never came. Because 5 minutes after the board voted, with a final count of 5-2 in Dania's favor, an internal audit report landed on her desk. It came from Shiloh, her new compliance officer, who'd been combing through Baycrest's back-channel finances for weeks. The twist? Craig hadn't just been disrespectful. He'd been stealing. Buried inside the financials were flagged transactions tied to shell consulting firms that were billing the Baycrest project for design advisory services. Nearly $480,000 had been siphoned off over 18 months, every invoice signed off by Craig. His name. His approval. The evidence was airtight. Dania didn't call the police. She didn't release a statement. She forwarded the report to the board chair and waited. By 4 p.m., she received word. Craig Ellison had officially resigned from all projects, boards, and public-facing roles. Permanently. His remaining equity? Forfeited. His name? Wiped from the Baycrest records. Silently. Cleanly. Irrevocably. The following week, Dania stood at the groundbreaking ceremony for the new Baycrest Marina. No podium. No ribbon. Just her in a black dress, standing alongside the local community members she'd invited into the process. There were food vendors, live music, and a massive digital banner that read, Baycrest, built with all of us in mind. No press releases, just real people, shaking her hand, saying thank you. That night, Dania walked the construction site alone. The cranes were still, the lights soft, and for a moment, she stood beneath the framework of what would one day be the new waterfront tower. Her tower. She looked up and said aloud, not to anyone, but maybe to someone who once doubted. You could have walked away with $9 million. Instead, I got everything. The headlines the next day were confused. Baycrest buyout finalized, but what's next? Developer Dania Price may be rebranding entire waterfront project. Speculation ran wild. Some assumed she'd build luxury townhomes. Others whispered about a tech hub or celebrity resort. But Dania said nothing. For 2 weeks, her office gave no comment. No interviews. No floor plans were leaked. No architectural renders circulated online. Until the morning of the announcement. 8 a.m. Local news trucks pulled into the gravel lot at Baycrest Marina, now cleared of Craig's banners and slogans. The air buzzed with curiosity and doubt. A podium had been set, but no media sheet had been provided. Just a single sign placed behind it. Build what was denied. At exactly 8:12, Dania stepped up to the microphone. Wearing denim and boots. No blazer. No corporate entourage. She looked out across the lot, not at the press, but at the people in folding chairs. Longtime Charleston residents, mostly black, mostly over 50, many of whom had been pushed out of this neighborhood 2 decades earlier. They weren't investors. They were the ones who'd been erased. And now? They were the only ones Dania spoke to. I'm not building more glass towers, she began. I'm not interested in condos people can't afford or offices nobody asked for. Silence. Then she lifted the curtain on the sign behind her. A rendering unfurled, not luxury apartments, not commercial retail, but a full-scale equity-driven campus. A co-op grocery store owned by local residents. A small business incubator offering rent-free startup space for the first 12 months. A cultural archive center dedicated to Charleston's Gullah history. A mixed-income housing complex, not low-income, not luxury, with rent caps locked by trust. And a training institute for construction and engineering jobs, prioritized for returning citizens. The crowd gasped. Reporters went silent. Let me ask you something. Have you ever watched a powerful person get the keys and actually use them to open the door for someone else? Have you ever seen wealth redefined, not in square footage, but in shared opportunity? That's what Dania did. And no one saw it coming. They tried to keep me from the property line, she said, voice strong. They saw my face and assumed I was here to take notes, not make decisions. But I've been planning this development for 15 years. She pointed toward the harbor. My mother walked this route every night after her second shift. She'd stop here, right here on this spot, and tell me the land would never be ours. That they'd build over us, again. And I believed her. Until I didn't. A hand went up from the audience. An older woman stood. Hair gray, eyes sharp. You say this is ours. How do we know that won't change in 10 years when the city wants to buy it all up again? Dania didn't flinch. That's why we're turning the Baycrest land into a permanent community land trust. The title is protected. The rent caps are locked. No outside buyer can flip this. Not for profit. Not ever. A long silence followed. Then applause. Then tears. Then standing ovation. Later that afternoon, a young reporter caught up with Dania in the parking lot. Why didn't you just cash out? You could have made double with luxury leases. Dania looked him in the eye. Because I didn't fight to be seen just to disappear again under a shinier logo. This isn't just a project. It's proof that you don't have to mimic power to take it. That night, Dania sat alone on the rooftop of her midtown office. The stars were faint, but the skyline glowed. She took out her old notebook, the one from 15 years ago, full of sketches and messy notes and pipe dreams. On the cover, her mother's words, scribbled in pen. If they won't build it for you, make them watch you build it anyway. She smiled, closed the notebook, and whispered to no one but herself. They watched, and now they'll never forget. They called it economic insanity. 3 days after Dania revealed her plans for the Baycrest redevelopment, no luxury condos, no private towers, no commercial strip, the backlash came fast and loud. National outlets latched onto the story. CEO walks away from millions to build. What? Is equity development even sustainable? Dania Price, visionary or wrecking ball? The mayor's office issued a neutral statement about local innovation, but insiders whispered that pressure was mounting from commercial real estate donors. Even state officials began circling the project, hinting that unconventional land use might cost Dania future grants and incentives. But Dania didn't blink. She prepared for the pushback. What she hadn't expected was the betrayal. It came from inside her own team. Shiloh, her head of compliance, the one who'd uncovered Craig's financial misconduct, the one who swore loyalty. Shiloh had been quietly meeting with a real estate lobbying group, feeding them data, proposal language, infrastructure rollout plans. They planned to discredit the Baycrest model. Nationally, she was offered a VP role in a new private equity firm if she helped slow the rollout and introduce market-corrected versions of the project to replace the land trust design. Dania found out 2 hours before the next city council hearing. She didn't scream, didn't threaten. She simply walked into Shiloh's office, laid down the termination papers, and said, I built this for truth, not trend. And definitely not for people who sell their names before they've earned them. Let me ask you something. Have you ever stood your ground while everyone around you is cashing out? Have you ever had to keep building while the people behind you chipped at your foundation? Then you know how Dania felt when she stood in front of the Charleston City Council that week. Lights hot, cameras ready, every seat full. She knew they weren't here to celebrate her vision. They were here to stop it. The chairperson asked the question with forced diplomacy. Miss Price, we have to ask, how do you justify leaving millions on the table when the city still faces budget gaps and affordable housing shortfalls? Dania stood, calm, blazer sharp, voice low but electric. I don't justify equity. I practice it. The money I walked away from? It was never mine to begin with. It was extracted from rising rents, forced evictions, and people who never got to finish a lease because the lobby never learned their names. Baycrest isn't a fantasy. It's a blueprint. You want to balance the budget? Stop balancing it on the backs of the people who already paid. Murmurs in the gallery. One woman stood and clapped before the room had even processed what was said. Then another. Then another. The council didn't vote that night. They postponed. Behind closed doors, they debated language, zoning variances, grant limitations. But the public? The public had already made up its mind. 3 days later, something no one predicted happened. 10 mayors from across the country, Atlanta, Milwaukee, Oakland, Durham, and more, signed a joint letter requesting that Dania replicate the Baycrest model in their cities. They called it a vision of urban ownership, not displacement. Suddenly, the same networks that called her reckless? Now they wanted interviews, panels, think tanks. One anchor from a national news show introduced her segment by saying, "When she got pushed out, she didn't push back. She bought the land, tore up the old plans, and wrote her own rules." Back at her office, Dania sat across from her new strategy director, a young, black architect named Tamara, who used to work retail before earning her license at 34. Tamara was grinning. "You really said no to $17 million in private funding this morning?" Dania nodded. "They wanted to rename the Workforce Center after a billionaire who's never even been to Charleston. You say yes to that once, and they start rewriting everything." Tamara paused. "And what if they keep coming?" "Then," Dania said, "we keep building until we're too big to be bought and too trusted to be silenced." That night, in her quiet apartment, Dania replayed the council session on her phone. She watched herself say, "You want to balance the budget? Stop balancing it on the backs of the people who already paid." She whispered it again. Not for the room. For herself. Because she knew the final phase was coming. The real test. And she was ready. The gates opened at 9 a.m. sharp. There was no ribbon. No champagne. No firework display. Just a brass plate mounted on stone that read, "Baycrest, built by the people they tried to exclude." Dania Montgomery Price stood beside it, hand resting gently on the edge. Her blazer was unbuttoned. Her heels flat. Her expression quiet. This was the moment she had carried in her head for 20 years. Not the celebration. The correction. And the people came. By the hundreds. Not politicians or celebrities. But mothers holding toddlers. Retired steelworkers in pressed denim shirts. College students who'd followed the story online. Barbers. Librarians. A woman who brought a framed photo of her father. "He worked here before they pushed us out." And they didn't come to watch. They came to walk through. Baycrest had opened. And everything about it was different. The first thing guests saw as they entered the main plaza was a wide digital board showing live data, not stock tickers, not property values, but community equity. How many residents had received job training that month? How many startups had launched from the incubator space? How many tenants had moved in without background checks meant to exclude them? Transparency, not spin. Let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a place and felt like it was built to keep you out, even if you couldn't explain why? Ever watched your parents or neighbors shrink their dreams because every door came with a security guard and a clipboard? Then you understand why people cried when Baycrest opened. Because it wasn't just a building. It was an answer. Inside the Workforce Center, Dania gave one final speech. No podium. She sat in a folding chair, facing the crowd like one of them. "I was told I was too angry, too proud, Too ambitious. They told me if I waited my turn, stayed quiet, maybe I'd be given a corner office. A small win. But I didn't want a corner office in their tower. I wanted the tower to be ours. Someone in the audience asked her what it felt like to go from outsider to builder. She paused, then answered with a smile. It feels like I'm finally standing on the ground my mother prayed I'd walk on. Outside, an older man stood alone by the land trust map. He wore a veteran's cap and held his cane like a flagpole. A volunteer approached and asked if he needed help. No, he said softly. I just wanted to see it with my own eyes. I've been told no so many times in this city, I forgot what yes looked like. He tapped the sidewalk with his cane. This is yes. That night, Daniel walked the grounds alone. The crowd had gone. The lights were low. But the feeling remained, like the city had finally exhaled. She stopped at the edge of the pier, where construction had once started. She pulled a weathered notebook from her coat, the same one she'd used to sketch her first vision. Inside was a new note, written in her own hand. Legacy is not how tall your building stands. It's who you refuse to leave behind while you were climbing. And now I want to speak directly to you, yes, you, listening from wherever you are. Maybe from a quiet kitchen. Or your work break. Maybe lying in bed, wondering if the fight you fought decades ago was ever worth it. I'm here to tell you. You weren't wrong to believe in fairness. You weren't foolish to expect dignity. And you weren't weak when they made you feel invisible. Because invisibility was never your truth. It was their failure to see you. And now? Now the buildings remember your name. Now the streets carry your footprints. Now the doors open because someone like you refused to wait outside. So if this story touched you, share it. If it reminded you of someone, send it to them. And if it made you sit up just a little straighter, then know this. You are the legacy they tried to bury. But you were never underground. You were just getting ready.